Inspector Purbright, the shadow that signed its name, a BBC radio thriller. It began, as such things often do in Flaxborough, without announcement. The morning was composed of small efficiencies, a milk float clinking along High Street, a solicitor's window blinds half raised to the light, and the faint hum of the town clock which, like many citizens, preferred to be 5 minutes late rather than rude. At precisely 9:10, Mr. Larch, clerk of the modest but reputable firm, Wedge and Plum, paused in his sorting. Among the neat envelopes and carbon copies lay a single sheet of foolscap. It was unsigned. The signature, if one could call it that, appeared only as a ghostly impression, a name pressed into the paper by a hand no longer present. And that name, beyond all doubt, belonged to a man deceased these 3 years. Mr. Larch frowned with the mild irritation of one whose system has been politely insulted. He showed it to Mr. Plum, who considered the matter grave enough to require a fresh pot of tea. The two men agreed that someone had erred. Papers sometimes migrated between files, just as memories slipped between generations. But Purbright, when the thing was mentioned in the course of a routine visit that afternoon, tilted his head slightly. His expression, that gentle neutrality which often disguised calculation, lingered a moment longer than politeness required. "Curious," he murmured. "A signature without a hand. We may have stumbled upon either a miracle or an administrative joke, Miss Teatime, visiting the station on unrelated business," for she frequently found herself on the periphery of curiosities, raised an eyebrow. "Flaxborough has never been rich in miracles, Inspector." "True," said Purbright, glancing at the faint indentation upon the page. "But we do manage a fair number of resurrections, mostly in gossip." Outside, the afternoon light fell in mild bands across the square. A cat crossed before the post office, its shadow exact and dignified. Nothing in the scene suggested malice or intrigue, which in Flaxborough was often the first sign of both. Later that evening, in the back room of the Chronicle, a typesetter laughed over a similar story. Another unsigned paper, another inconvenient signature. It would make a pleasant filler for Thursday's edition. By nightfall, the small town, that collection of tidy suspicions and respectable curiosities, had already begun its silent work. Someone would tell someone else. A detail would change. A theory would form, and Inspector Purbright, in his house on the edge of the square, would note a small oddity in his ledger. Letter bearing deceased's name. Source uncertain. Observed developments. He closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and allowed the stillness to return. The calm, as ever, would not last. By Wednesday, the air in Flaxborough carried a faint taste of expectation, a sweetness not unlike the aroma from Mrs. Bradby's tea room at 10:30, when the first batch of scones met their brief encounter with sunlight. The gossip, warm as the pastry, had begun to rise. Someone had heard that a second document, similar in character to the first, had surfaced in the office of Peebles and Son, a less reputable firm, but no less diligent in matters of scandal. This one, it seemed, bore instructions to alter a will, not to benefit the living, but to deprive them. Mrs. Bradby, though not a woman of cruel disposition, found the subject deliciously mysterious. The widows at table 3 were unanimous in their admiration for whoever possessed such audacity. "To sign from beyond the grave," said Mrs. Ollerenshaw, "is either divine or diabolical. Either way, I call it style." Through the window, fog pressed gently against the glass, blurring the outline of the post office across the street. Inside, teaspoons chimed with a sort of conspiratorial rhythm. Words drifted. Names, speculations, small triumphs of deduction. The more imaginative citizens of Flaxborough began to suspect that the dead, tired of their silence, had resumed correspondence at that same hour. Inspector Purbright stood by the window of his office, reading the Chronicle. A brief paragraph occupied the lower corner of page 3. "Curious paperwork disturbs local solicitors." It had been written with all the solemn vagueness that a small-town editor could muster. Purbright folded it once, then again, and laid it neatly aside. "Sir," said Sergeant Malley, approaching with the soft tread of one interrupting thought. "Mr. Plum called again. Says another firm's had the same trouble." A letter, apparently. Handwritten. No signature this time, but the same style. One of the witnesses insists the writing looked, well, hesitant. Like it knew what it shouldn't be doing. Purbright turned, eyes mild but attentive. "Hesitant," he repeated. "That's a compassionate choice of word, Malley. I wonder if paper ever feels guilt." Malley looked uncertain whether this required an answer. "Should I fetch the document, sir?" "If it's been shown to too many already," said Purbright, "we may as well be last in line. Let's pay our respects to Peebles and Son." The walk was short, but the fog thickened, softening each footstep into a private echo. Somewhere distant, a church bell murmured 11:30. The town seemed wrapped in its own breath, every window a pale eye half-lidded with secrecy. Inside the solicitor's office, the smell of dust and damp paper held court. Mr. Peebles himself, a man whose eyebrows communicated far more than his tongue, presented the letter like evidence in a séance. "There it is, Inspector. Arrived by post on Monday. No return address. You'll note the old-fashioned ink. Slightly bluish, almost decorative. And the phrasing. Rather genteel for a threat." Purbright bent over the paper. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, but curiously strained, each loop of the pen suggesting restraint, as if the writer feared that emotion might betray identity. He read aloud softly. "It is a pity when kindness outlives conscience. Some names should remain unsigned." Purbright looked up. No signature again. A pity indeed. It might have saved us time, Mr. Peebles shuffled. "No crime, though, Inspector." "Unless penmanship's become one." "Not yet," Purbright said, folding the letter. "But the town does enjoy rehearsing for crimes. It keeps them entertained." As they stepped out, the fog had deepened into a pale drizzle, beading on Malley's uniform. The inspector paused beneath a lamp-post, whose light trembled faintly in the damp air. "Malley," he said quietly, "do you recall the ink used on that first document? The clerk described it as faintly grey. This, however, leans toward blue." "Yes, sir." "Almost as though the writer were running out of one bottle and making do with another." Malley frowned. "Could be coincidence," Purbright smiled gently. "In Flaxborough, coincidences usually keep each other company." They walked back past the square, where the evening lamps were beginning to breathe into life. Through the drawn curtains of the tea-room, figures leaned closer across tables, voices muffled by steam and curiosity. Behind every window the same subject rehearsed itself: the mysterious letters, the unseen hand, the polite thrill of someone else's unease. By nightfall, even the Chronicle's proofreader, who rarely noticed anything outside his own spelling, had heard of the phantom correspondent. The phrase pleased him so much that he placed it as a potential headline for Thursday's edition, should events continue obligingly, strange Purbright, at his desk once more, turned the anonymous letter over in his hand. The paper was of fine quality old stock, faintly perfumed. Something one might have found among a lady's stationery 30 years before. He dipped his pen into the ink pot and wrote on the back of his report. Possible pattern forming. Writer's motive uncertain. Tone suggests reproof rather than gain. He sat a while longer, listening to the faint ticking of the station clock and the shuffle of Malley's papers. Somewhere outside, a train passed on the distant line. The low, mournful note of steel across distance. Then, from beyond the open window, a sound, the soft clatter of hooves, followed by laughter, the unmistakable chatter of two women crossing the square. Words half-caught drifted up through the fog. "And they say the letter was meant for old Mr. Chivers. That it changed his will entirely." "Changed?" "My dear, it saved it. Left everything to the niece again." Rather touching, really. Purbright leaned back. The town, it seemed, was already inventing motives kinder than truth. He extinguished the lamp, leaving only the glimmer of fog at the glass. The letter, lying pale upon the desk, caught the last of the light like a ghost recalling its own name. The whispers outside swelled, then thinned, carried off into the mist. As Flaxborough prepared itself for another morning of discovery, opinion, and delight in mystery. The following morning arrived with the muffled insistence of rain, a patient drizzle that flattened the colours of Flaxborough and left the pavements shining like half-remembered glass. The town, chastened by weather, spoke more softly. Curtains opened later. Even gossip took shelter. Inspector Purbright preferred such days. The streets became reflective, obliging thought to slow to the rhythm of raindrops. He walked without hurry, umbrella neatly angled, his expression suggesting neither investigation nor leisure, but a third condition known only to those who listen for what people choose not to say. At the post office, the smell of ink and damp wool mingled with the faint sweetness of adhesive gum. The postmistress, Mrs. Brill, regarded Purbright with that defensive civility reserved for officials of equal rank. "Morning, Inspector. I suppose you'll be wanting stamps or suspects." "Neither, for once," Purbright replied, resting his umbrella by the counter. "Merely curiosity about letters, the anonymous kind." Mrs. Brill pursed her lips.
"Ah, those? I've heard tell of them."
"Though you'll not hear it from me officially." "Of course not," said Purbright gently.
"Unofficially, however, I'd be grateful for your memory."
"Has anything lately passed through your hands bearing an older make of stationery, perhaps of the kind once scented, faintly floral?" Mrs. Brill thought, eyes flicking up as if consulting the ceiling. "Now you mention it, a bundle last week. Pale blue envelopes, good quality, foreign perhaps."
"No return mark."
"Came with others, all paid in cash. Posted by whom?" She hesitated. Small person. "Hood up."
"Couldn't say if man or woman. The voice."
"Well, there was none." Just a nod. Purbright smiled as though he had expected no less. "And paid with coins, not notes?" Mrs. Brill nodded. "Silver shillings, old ones. 1940s issue." The inspector thanked her, left a polite bow of gratitude, and stepped back into the rain. He made a note as he walked. Prefers invisibility. Values precision. Sentimentally attached to old currency. The solicitor's office came next. Mr. Plum awaited him, an anxious smile arranged with care.
"Ah, Inspector."
"About these letters. We've locked them up, I assure you."
"Nasty business, nasty?"
said Purbright, removing his hat.
"I find it rather illiterary." Mr. Plum blinked.
"Literary, sir?" "Yes. Anonymous authorship, suspense, moral correction, all the ingredients of a good provincial novel. You and I, Mr. Plum, may merely be turning the pages." Plum looked doubtful.
"Still, it's unsettling."
"We've clients whispering that the deceased are intervening."
"And those still living?" "While they're looking over their shoulders." Purbright turned toward the cabinet where the offending letters rested under lock. "Have you by chance compared the handwriting across each document?"
"Once," said Plum, "enough to confirm that it's consistent. A fine, looping hand, as though the writer were taught before pens grew lazy." "That," Purbright murmured, "is not the work of youth." He replaced his hat, nodded, and departed, leaving behind an office relieved by his absence, but faintly chilled by the impression that their calm had been politely inspected and returned in its box. By early afternoon, the rain had withdrawn, leaving behind a thin mist that turned every tree into a faded photograph. Purbright crossed the market square where puddles mirrored the grey sky, and children tested their boots with private satisfaction. He followed the narrow lane to an old terrace, 3 houses long, whose middle occupant was a retired schoolmaster, known locally for immaculate penmanship and a temperament slightly less forgiving than Scripture. Mr. Ellison answered the knock with the expression of a man confronted by bureaucracy in physical form. "Inspector."
"I've paid all my taxes and buried all my relatives."
"What remains?" Only my curiosity, Mr. Ellison. May I intrude upon it for a few minutes?" The old man gestured toward a narrow parlour heavy with books and the dry scent of chalk. "Mind the cat? She distrusts authority." The cat, as if in agreement, removed itself to the window-sill. Purbright sat. The room was dim. Dust motes drifted through the pale light like suspended punctuation. "I understand," Purbright began, "that you once tutored a number of the town's clerks, among them Mr. Larch of Wedge and Plum." Ellison nodded.
"Good pupil. Terrible memory for verbs and handwriting?"
"Serviceable. My own was better, of course." Purbright smiled, glancing at the framed certificate above the mantel. "Royal Society of Penmanship, 1929. I imagine few today could match it. Tell me, have you lately sold or given away any writing materials? Old ink? Unused paper, perhaps?"
"Sold? Certainly not. I'm no stationer. Given away, then." Ellison's eyes narrowed.
"You've heard something."
"Who suggested I might?"
"No one," said Purbright mildly. "But people who write well often attract those who wish to learn. You may have inspired someone." The schoolmaster's face softened, though not with pride. "There was a lady once, called herself Mrs. Danning, said she wished to improve her hand for correspondence. Came twice, paid promptly."
"I never saw her again. When was this?"
2, perhaps 3 months ago. Can you describe her?" "Refined, quiet, gloved even indoors, eyes the colour of faded ink." Purbright stood, thanking him. As he turned to leave, Ellison added, "If she's done something foolish, I expect it's from loneliness, not wickedness. The hand trembles differently in such cases." The remark lingered with him through the walk back to the station. Dusk had arrived unnoticed. Lamps blinked into life, their light pooling on wet cobbles. From somewhere down the lane came the low hum of a radio, a waltz dissolving into static. Inside the office, Sergeant Malley looked up. "Find anything, sir?" "Possibly," Purbright said, setting his hat on the peg. "A shadow with handwriting lessons and a taste for discretion. It seems our forger writes not for gain, but for conscience." "Conscience, sir?"
"Yes, Malley?"
"The most exhausting motive of all." He drew the anonymous letters from the drawer, spreading them beneath the lamp. Each bore the same slow elegance. Careful, unhurried, restrained. The strokes thickened slightly toward each curve, as if weighed by memory. "Notice the rhythm," he said quietly. "This isn't deceit."
"It's apology," Malley frowned.
"And what's being confessed?" Purbright regarded the faint scent still clinging to the paper, a fragrance almost gone but unmistakably personal. "That," he said, "we shall ask the ink to tell us. Ink, unlike people, forgets very little." The clock struck 6. Beyond the window the rain began again, softer this time, like handwriting fading on damp paper. And somewhere in the town, a woman with gloved hands folded another letter, pausing just long enough for her conscience to steady. By Thursday morning the drizzle had lifted, and with it came the comfort of renewed certainty. Flaxborough, having exhausted its appetite for mystery, began constructing its own conclusions, light, tidy, and reassuringly local. The town disliked loose ends. It preferred them snipped, tied, and labelled before the weekend. At Mrs. Bradby's tea-room, opinion had hardened like yesterday's scones. "It's that clerk, mark my words," declared Mrs. Ollerenshaw, with authority born of repetition.
"Young Larch, the one with the nervous spectacles."
"He's always making copies. Perhaps he copied something he shouldn't." Around her, heads nodded. Someone added that his aunt once saw him after hours in the firm's office. Another had heard he dabbled in amateur dramatics, and therefore, clearly, forgery. By the time the tea had cooled, the matter was all but settled. Across the square, the Chronicle office hummed with quiet satisfaction. Its editor, Mr. Babbacombe, had composed an editorial under the heading, "The Dangers of Gossip and the Importance of Minded Business." The irony, though unintentional, gave the piece a pleasing symmetry. It read, in part, "Recent rumours regarding so-called letters from the beyond remind us that Flaxborough thrives on invention. We must beware of imagination without evidence, lest we embarrass both heaven and ourselves. Purbright read the printed sheet at his desk, lips lifting just enough to suggest amusement rather than approval. "Excellent," he murmured, "a sermon delivered by the choir itself." Sergeant Malley, polishing his penholder, ventured, "So the town's decided, then?"
"All solved, sir?"
"Apparently," said Purbright. "We may all return to our teacups and consciences." "Do you believe it's the clerk, sir?" Purbright set the paper aside. "Belief, Malley, is a luxury we borrow from those with less imagination. I prefer curiosity." Outside, sunlight trembled upon the wet cobbles. The air, newly scrubbed, smelled faintly of lilac from the vicarage hedge. Life resumed its ordinary pulse, bicycles gliding, shop bells ringing, the sound of distant hooves fading along the high street. By mid-afternoon, the official calm had become contagious. Even Mr. Plum, who had begun the week as a man personally affronted by mystery, now felt reassured by the town's verdict. He telephoned the police station to announce that Wedge and Plum would not, after all, pursue the matter further. "We're satisfied it was an internal error," he said. "Mr. Larch has apologized, though for what exactly he isn't sure. But it seems proper to draw a line." Purbright listened with the civility of a doctor, humouring a self-diagnosis. "A line is an admirable thing, Mr. Plum, particularly when one doesn't know what lies beneath it." After he had replaced the receiver, he stood a moment longer gazing at the rows of neatly labelled folders on his shelf. Order was an illusion he appreciated, but never trusted. Later, at the Market Square Cafe, he found Miss Teatime in her usual corner, her coffee untouched, a small stack of correspondence before her. She looked up with a smile both knowing and faintly conspiratorial. "So the town has spoken," she said. "Young Larch is guilty, or nearly so. We shall hang him in rumour and save the expense of rope." Purbright took the opposite chair. A thrift-minded execution. "Flaxborough's favourite sort." Miss Teatime tilted her head. "You don't believe it, of course." "I rarely believe in what ends too comfortably," Purbright replied. "Life prefers loose stitching." She leaned closer, lowering her voice, though the cafe was half empty. "I hear another letter was found, this one at the solicitor's own house."
"Addressed to his wife, of all people."
"She's refused to say what it contained, but her expression this morning resembled that of a woman who's just recognized her own handwriting." Purbright's brow lifted slightly. "Then our correspondent grows bold. Or intimate." "I think," Miss Teatime said, stirring her coffee, "they simply grow careless." The clink of the spoon echoed softly, filling the pause that followed. Outside, a motor car passed, trailing a brief shimmer of reflected light across the window pane. Purbright rose, slipping a coin onto the saucer. "Carelessness, Miss Teatime, is the final refuge of the diligent. They grow weary of precision. When that happens, the truth usually forgets its disguise." She watched him go, her expression one of faint amusement mixed with something gentler. Admiration, perhaps, or concern. Back at the station, the evening light slanted low across the desks. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and damp paper. Malley was sorting reports, humming without conviction. Purbright sat, opened a folder, and drew from it the latest anonymous letter retrieved from Mrs. Plum's bureau that afternoon. The paper was the same, high quality, faint perfume, but the tone had changed. He read the first line twice. To correct what affection has obscured is no betrayal, only memory reasserting its right. He placed the sheet down carefully, almost reverently. "Sir?" Malley asked. Purbright spoke without looking up. "Tell me, Malley, when people decide a story is finished, what becomes of the pages that follow?" "I suppose they're thrown away, sir." "Just so," said Purbright quietly. "But sometimes the story keeps writing itself, even without readers." He rose, walking to the window where dusk was gathering in soft layers. Across the square the lamps began to bloom. He could just see the reflection of Mrs. Bradby's tea room, now crowded again, the silhouettes inside leaning close like parishioners over confession. Flaxborough had restored its calm, but beneath the civility something whispered, not gossip, not fear, but anticipation. A hush before the next page turned. Purbright folded his hands behind his back. "Mally," he said softly, "if anyone asks, tell them the matter's concluded. Let the town enjoy its illusion of completion. Yes, sir. And meanwhile," he added, "let us continue reading." The sound of rain returned at last, a gentle, secret rhythm against the panes, as the inspector's reflection merged with the darkness beyond, and Flaxborough's neat explanation began already to come undone. That night, long after the town had settled into its habitual murmuring sleep, Purbright remained at his desk. The lamps in the station cast a low amber pool of light upon the table, where the 3 letters lay arranged like specimens. Their ink, faintly bluish, slightly granular, caught his attention in a way it had not before. Something in its hue felt oddly nostalgic, as if it belonged to an era when correspondence was an art rather than an act. He held the paper close to the lamplight. The sheen was duller than common blue-black, more the colour of dusk than midnight. It recalled to him the precise tone of ink he had once seen in a ledger dated 1939, a ledger from a stationer long vanished.
"From the High Street, Mally,"
he said softly. The sergeant stirred from his paperwork, blinking. "Sir?" "Fetch the supply register, the one listing obsolete inks and brands. You'll find it under the cabinet marked Miscellaneous Curiosities, which, if you recall, contains half the town." Mally obeyed, brushing dust from an old leather folder. Within it, the pages listed a parade of extinct goods: sealing wax, dip pens, ration-era stationery. Purbright's finger stopped at a name he half remembered. Holbein's Blue Permanent, discontinued after 1952 when the firm closed during a post-war chemical shortage. He smiled faintly. "There we are. Holbein's Blue, rare, subtle, unmistakably old-fashioned." Mally peered over his shoulder. "Not seen that in years, sir." "Indeed," said Purbright, standing. "And yet our correspondent writes as though time was something they could order by the bottle." The next morning dawned grey, a soft fog drifting across the market. Purbright walked its edges slowly, hat tilted against the damp, eyes moving from one shuttered shop front to another. The town's history lingered in its architecture, every lintel and faded sign a whisper of commerce long extinguished. At the far end of the square stood a narrow doorway half swallowed by ivy. Meridew Stationers. Its gilt lettering, ghostly on the glass, spoke of a time when handwriting was a virtue. The shop had closed a decade before, yet Purbright knew the building remained under the care of the late proprietor's niece, who let rooms above to travelling salesmen and temperamental pianists. He rapped softly. The door opened a cautious inch. "Miss Meridew?" A woman's face appeared, pale as the fog behind her. "Yes, I'm not taking orders, Inspector. There's no trade left to speak of." "Not trade," said Purbright gently. "Only inquiry. May I step in?" Reluctance yielded to resignation. She led him through a dim corridor lined with dusty display cases. Inside, relics of a meticulous age, blotters, sealing sets, ivory-handled pens arranged like surgical tools. The air smelled of dust and faded gum arabic. "You'll find little worth stealing," she said. "I was hoping to borrow your memory instead." Her eyes flickered with amusement. "That too is somewhat faded." Purbright smiled. "Perhaps not entirely. Tell me, Miss Meridew, do you recall selling a brand called Holbein's Blue Permanent?" She paused, considering.
"Of course."
"It was our pride. Made in London. Too rich for most. Went out of production 20 years ago. And yet," said Purbright, "someone in Flaxborough still writes with it." She blinked. "Impossible." I sold the last bottles to a collector in Nottingham before the shop closed. A collector?
A gentleman of refined manners.
Paid in cash. Said he disliked modern inks. They lacked sincerity. Purbright nodded. Do you remember his name? No, but I do recall his hands, neat-gloved.
And the way he spoke.
Slow, deliberate. The sort of man who corrects other people's punctuation without apology. He looked around the dim shop, tracing the outlines of ledgers and ink bottles. The silence seemed to thicken, and if someone here had kept a bottle back, perhaps a sentimental keepsake. Miss Merridew hesitated. My uncle did keep one. He thought it lucky. It should still be in the upstairs cabinet, unless one of the tenants fancied themselves a writer. Would you mind if I had a look? She led him up a narrow stairwell where the wallpaper curled like old parchment. The top floor smelled faintly of lavender and coal. In a corner cupboard, among unused notebooks and dried nibs, stood a small bottle half filled with blue ink. Dust frosting its shoulders. Purbright lifted it gently. Holbein's, he said. The very shade. Miss Merridew folded her arms.
If it's of interest, one of my tenants, Mrs. Danning, asked about it some months ago.
Said she wanted to write thank-you notes on proper paper. The name stirred faint recognition. Mrs. Danning, you're certain? Quite. She left in August. Paid in advance, posted her key.
A quiet woman. Polite, always wore gloves. Outside, the church bell began to sound the quarter hour, each tone absorbed by fog.
Purbright replaced the bottle, his mind aligning fragments like careful script. The ink, the letters, the handwriting lessons, the perfume. A pattern formed, faint but undeniable. When he returned to the street, Flaxborough seemed to hold its breath. The market stalls were closing. Shutters fell with hollow claps. Across the square, the Chronicle's windows glowed, its type hammers tapping out certainty, while the truth slipped quietly elsewhere. At the station, Malley looked up from his notes. Find anything, sir? Something small, Purbright replied, hanging his coat. The sort of thread one almost overlooks until it begins to pull at everything around it. He placed the ink sample on the desk, its contents trembling slightly with the movement. Holbein's blue, he said. Discontinued 20 years ago, and yet our letters are fresh, which means either our culprit collects ghosts, or they are one, Malley exhaled. Do we know who, sir? Not yet, but we know what she writes with, what she learned from, and perhaps why. He seated himself, gaze returning to the pale script of the most recent letter. Imagine, he said softly, someone who believes the world wronged by memory, someone who cannot speak without apology, yet insists that the past must be corrected in ink. Malley said nothing. Outside, the rain began again, a patient tapping like fingers on glass. Purbright leaned back, eyes half closed, the rhythm of droplets syncing with his thoughts.
Find me, he murmured.
Any reference to Mrs. Danning? Let's see where politeness ends and confession begins. He opened his notebook and wrote one final line beneath the others. Ink, once dry, cannot repent. But those who write it still might. The bell at the town hall struck 7. The light dimmed, folding the station into shadow. The ink bottle caught a faint gleam. The last of the day, before the darkness took it, like memory sealing itself against discovery. The next morning the rain had ceased, leaving behind a soft silver haze that made the rooftops glimmer like old pewter. Flaxborough, rinsed clean of noise, appeared almost innocent again. But innocence in that town was rarely more than a trick of the light. Inside the police station, Purbright sat before a spread of papers that no longer seemed separate incidents, but arteries of a single beating network. Wills, notes, letters, and receipts lay stitched together by ink, faintly bluish, gently vindictive. Each document whispered of human arithmetic. What was owed? What withheld? What forgiven? Too late to matter. Malley, he said, as the sergeant entered with the careful tread of a man bringing both tea and news. If one wished to rewrite history, not entirely, just the small provincial sort, where would one begin? Mally set the cup down. I suppose, sir, with a pen. Precisely. Purbright smiled faintly. And one's memory, of course. But memory, as we know, tends to require stationery. He turned over a will dated 4 years prior. The estate of one Mrs. Eleanor Chivers, deceased, who had left her modest holdings to her husband's niece, a quiet woman who had since moved away. Recently, however, the solicitor had received a new version of the will, unsigned but authentic-looking, leaving everything instead to a local charity. The signature, like the others, bore that faintly spectral indentation, a name written by an invisible hand. Chivers, Purbright murmured. Widow of the tobacconist, a kind woman, I recall. She lent freely, forgave quickly, not the sort to provoke revenge, unless, said Mally cautiously, someone thought her forgiveness misplaced. Purbright nodded, pleased. Very good. Morality, Mally, is never as simple as the vicar advertises. It breeds as many grudges as it cures. He stood, coat already buttoned, and gestured toward the door. Oh, come along. Let's see how far these veins run. They began at the solicitor's archive, where the scent of paper and old air formed its own atmosphere. Part ecclesiastical, part embalmed. Files stood in rows like parishioners awaiting confession. Mr. Plum, pale but obliging, handed over a ledger with visible relief, as though ridding himself of something slightly haunted. Every document in question passed through these drawers, Inspector. Nothing supernatural, I assure you.
Only clerical error. Clerical error, Purbright repeated, weighing the phrase as if it might reveal its guilt by tone alone. A comforting diagnosis.
It saves everyone the trouble of thinking. He opened the ledger. Neat columns of names, bequests, and dates lined the page, but within them a rhythm emerged, too deliberate to be chance. The altered wills belonged almost exclusively to those whose reputations had endured a quiet blemish. Not crimes, but small unkindnesses, a debt unacknowledged, a rumour spread, a friendship soured. Purbright traced a finger down the page. Whoever writes these letters knows more of character than law. From behind, Plum said uncertainly, Inspector, if you're implying moral judgment, I can assure you our office does not. I'm implying observation, Purbright interrupted gently.
A rarer and more dangerous skill. He closed the ledger.
Thank you, Mr. Plum. If your conscience grows restless, I suggest tea. They stepped back into the street, where the fog had thinned to a pale gauze. The bell from St. Olaf's marked the quarter hour, its echo drifting down the narrow lanes. Purbright paused outside the tobacconist's old shop. Shuttered now, its window ghosted with the outline of forgotten advertisements. He stared a moment, then crossed to the door. Through the glass, the dim interior showed a counter covered in dust, an old ledger open upon it, its pages faintly curled. Mally, he said, fetch the key from the council clerk. I believe this shop still holds its last sale, unpaid. Within the hour, they were inside. The air smelled of stale smoke and damp wood. Sunlight, fractured by grime, fell across the counter like faded ink. Purbright lifted the ledger carefully. The handwriting was familiar. Neat, elegant, the same looping restraint as the anonymous letters. He turned a page and another. Near the end, a final entry caught his eye. Debt forgiven. J.D. Danning, £2, 10 shillings. Settled in spirit, he read it twice. Danning, he said quietly.
The name returns like a line unbroken, Mally frowned. You think she's connected to the Chivers will? I think she's connected to everyone who once owed.
Or was owed, something they never admitted. He closed the book. Dust rising like exhaled memory as evening settled, the two men walked the length of High Street. Windows glowed, kettles sang faintly in back kitchens. Behind those curtains, Purbright imagined letters folded in drawers, Words written in secret at dressing tables, confessions disguised as corrections. Flaxborough's heart, beneath its civil quiet, pulsed with unspoken reckonings. At the post office, Mrs. Brill greeted them with her usual blend of suspicion and civic pride. "Back again, Inspector."
"I hope the letters haven't multiplied." "Not multiplied," Purbright said.
"Merely deepened." She blinked.
"You do speak peculiarly. Occupational hazard." He smiled faintly. "Tell me, Mrs. Brill, did Mrs. Danning ever receive post here?"
"Or perhaps forward any?" Mrs. Brill thought a moment, eyes brightening with recollection.
"Indeed she did."
"A parcel now and then, always wrapped in brown paper, tied, just so, sent to herself under a different name."
"E. Chivers, once, I believe." Purbright inclined his head.
How thoughtful of her to keep her ghosts in circulation. As they stepped back into the misty air, Mally asked, "So she was sending the letters to herself?" "Perhaps," said Purbright, "or perhaps to the memory of others. Some people correspond only with what they've lost." They walked in silence until the square opened before them, the lamps flickering into amber life. Purbright stopped by the fountain, its trickle barely audible. "Mally, do you ever notice how the town seems to write itself? Every day, without ink? Words traded, reputations adjusted, histories edited to fit the mood?" "Yes, sir. But most of it's harmless. Most," Purbright agreed. "But sometimes the editor grows ambitious." He drew from his pocket the list of altered names, Chivers, Plum, Danning, Larch, and studied it in the failing light. Each name, he realized, touched another, forming a circle of small indebtedness and quiet guilt. It was less a conspiracy than a correspondence between the living and the remorseful. The faint wind stirred the paper in his hand, and somewhere far off a train called through the dusk. Its sound carried across the fields like a long sigh. Purbright folded the list, slipped it into his coat, and turned toward the station. Behind them, the town glowed softly. Lamps reflecting on wet cobbles, shadows moving within drawn curtains. Each window a sentence in an unending letter, and somewhere, unseen, someone dipped a pen into the last bottle of Holbein's blue and began another page. It was nearing dusk when the new letter arrived, unheralded, unremarkable in its envelope, carried by the same modest post that bore grocery bills and parish notices. Yet, by the time it reached its recipient, the quiet rhythm of Flaxborough had altered. The letter was addressed to Mr. Henry Plum. He was sitting in his office, spectacles balanced precariously on his nose, when the postboy handed it through the door. The handwriting, fine and careful, caught his attention before he even slit the seal. He read only the first line before his hand began to tremble. Outside, a passerby later recalled hearing the sound of a chair toppling, followed by a slow, irregular thud. By the time the clerk entered, Plum was on the floor, the letter crumpled in his hand. His pulse fluttered, faint but alive. The doctor called it shock. Purbright, arriving moments later, called it something else. The inspector bent down beside the desk, retrieving the letter from the carpet. The ink had smudged faintly where Plum's fingers had pressed too hard. He unfolded it with care, as though the words might dissolve if startled. When truth is rewritten by silence, it returns to correct its punctuation. "Forgive me for what should have been said in daylight. Beneath the line, no signature. Only that familiar indentation, the trace of a name too heavy to write." Purbright stood very still. Through the window, the late afternoon sun slanted across the office, catching the dust in mid-air, turning it into faint gold motes. The light had the brittle quality of something nearing its end. "Mally," he said softly. The sergeant, standing near the doorway, nodded. "He's still breathing, sir. The doctor says it's more fright than illness." "Fright," Purbright murmured, glancing again at the letter. "An underrated cause of mortality." He placed the folded sheet in an envelope and turned toward the window. Outside, the bell of St. Olaf's struck 5, the sound hanging long and hollow through the streets. "Send a constable to fetch Mrs. Plum," he said, "and have this letter brought to the station once she's seen it." By the time the inspector returned to his office, twilight had begun to spread like ink spilled across the town.
Lamps glowed in the square, soft halos floating in the mist.
The station itself seemed dimmer than usual, as though reluctant to host what the letter might reveal. Purbright placed it upon his desk beneath the lamp, the glow catching the faint gleam of the words. He read it again, then again, slower each time, listening not to the phrases but to the silence between them. When Miss Teatime arrived unannounced, he didn't look up immediately. "I saw the constable hurrying through the square," she said, "and a doctor's card outside Plum's office. You've had another, haven't you?" "Yes." His tone was low, thoughtful. "And this one nearly fulfilled its purpose." "Purpose?" "To be read aloud by conscience." She approached the desk, gloved hands clasped. "Do you believe Plum was the target?" Purbright's eyes flicked to her. "No, the letter wasn't written to him. It was written for him."
"There's a difference." Miss Teatime tilted her head, studying him.
"And what precisely would one write for a solicitor?" "Redemption," said Purbright. "Lawyers are archivists of guilt. They keep the past in tidy envelopes."
"Occasionally it leaks," she frowned slightly. "And what leaks here?"
"Regret," he said after a pause, "but not his." The clock in the corridor struck softly. The sound of footsteps echoed beyond the door, then faded. Purbright took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the letter's final line. "Forgive me for what should have been said in daylight," he repeated. "A phrase like that doesn't belong to vengeance. It belongs to confession." Miss Teatime's expression softened. "Then you think the writer seeks forgiveness?" "I think," Purbright said, "she seeks permission to stop writing." Outside, the fog thickened, pressing gently against the windows. The gas lamps along the street glimmered faintly, their reflections trembling on the wet cobbles. Mally entered, cap in hand. "Mrs. Plum's at home, sir. She said the letter mentioned something about her late husband's dealings with a Mrs. Danning. She was upset. Said her husband barely knew the woman." "Barely," Purbright repeated, a word that hides more than it reveals. "Thank you, Mally. That will be all." When the sergeant had gone, Purbright turned again to Miss Teatime. "Every thread leads back to her, doesn't it? Mrs. Danning, the woman with the polite pen?" "She sounds lonely," Miss Teatime said quietly. "Yes," said Purbright. "And loneliness, Miss Teatime, is the most industrious of crimes. It always finds work." He stood, walked to the window and looked out. Across the square, the faint outline of the old tobacconist's shop stood dimly visible. Above it, a single light glowed in an upper window. "Tell me," he said softly, "have you ever noticed how guilt prefers company, yet solitude is what gives it voice?" Miss Teatime watched him, her face unreadable. "And what do you intend to do, Inspector?" "Listen," he said.
"Not to the living, they've already settled their stories, but to what the letters refuse to say aloud." The station was silent, save for the faint rustle of paper as he unfolded the letter one last time.
His eyes lingered on the handwriting. Steady, elegant, but burdened, as if each word were a step through fog. "Absolution," he murmured. "That's what she's been writing toward all along."
"These aren't accusations."
"They're amendments." He set it down, extinguished the lamp, and for a moment the only light came from the window. The thin, uncertain glow of gas lamps filtered through mist. It washed over the room in shades of grey and blue, the same tones as the ink itself. Purbright's voice was quiet, almost reflective. "You see, Miss Teatime, some people confess not to priests or police, but to paper. They ask forgiveness from ink because ink never interrupts." Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour. Each chime deepened the stillness between them. Miss Teatime rose, her voice soft but certain. If she's seeking forgiveness, then she must believe someone was wronged, perhaps even saved. Purbright's gaze did not move from the letter. "Perhaps both," he said. Flaxborough likes its morality as it likes its tea, strong enough to taste, but never enough to scald. He turned at last, his expression touched by something close to sorrow. But I fear this writer's been drinking alone for too long. A gust of wind stirred the curtains, dimming the last light in the room. For a moment, everything held still, the papers, the lamp, the faint outline of Purbright's silhouette, as though the entire town had paused between one confession and the next. Then the clock resumed its ticking. The inspector, eyes half lowered, reached for his pen and began to write, letters now personal, tone shifting toward atonement.
No crime intended one need only a correction of memory. He stopped,
Let the ink dry, and closed the book. Outside, the last of the daylight thinned, leaving only the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. Thoughtful, patient, and for once touched by melancholy. When Purbright left the station that night, the fog had grown denser, folding the square into a pale hush. Each street lamp hovered within its own small halo, a trembling coin of light adrift in silence. His footsteps sounded soft against the damp cobbles,
measured and unhurried, the rhythm of a man who walks not toward an answer,
but within one. He passed the churchyard, where the air smelled faintly of rain-soaked stone and lilac, and thought of letters, not as messages but as instruments. Words, he reflected, could do what the law rarely managed. They could rearrange remorse into understanding, guilt into narrative, sorrow into something almost dignified. He had seen enough of human correspondence to know that most letters were not written to inform, but to endure. The ones arriving from Mrs. Danning's unseen hand were no different. They were, he sensed, the product of someone not asking to be forgiven, but to remain heard. Across the square a dog barked once and was answered only by its echo. Purbright turned down the narrow lane that led to the row of houses beyond the vicarage. Here the lamps grew fewer and the air colder. He stopped before the final gate, a small, iron thing half swallowed by ivy, and regarded the house beyond. It was modest, withdrawn from the road, its curtains drawn except for one faint gleam of lamplight at the upper window. A house where grief might live quietly, without complaint. Mrs. Danning's house. He stood for a moment, then walked up the short path, boots crunching on damp gravel. The door opened before he knocked. The woman who stood there was neither young nor old, though time had treated her with the sort of restraint given to those who rarely invite notice. She wore gloves in soft grey, and a cardigan button wrong at the top. "Inspector Purbright," she said, as if expecting him. "You've come to ask why I write." The remark was so calm that he almost smiled. "If that's what you've been doing, madam, I might only ask whether you mean to stop." Her lips curved faintly. "That depends on whether anyone's listening." She stepped aside and he entered. The air within was faintly perfumed with lavender and ink. A small fire murmured in the grate. Beside it stood a writing desk, its surface arranged with impossible neatness. Paper, pens, a single small bottle of blue ink, no more than half full. Purbright removed his hat. "Holbein's blue," he observed gently. "A shade I had nearly forgotten." She glanced toward the bottle. "It's old, but it doesn't spoil if one writes sparingly." He studied her face, not unkindly.
"You've been writing to the living on behalf of the dead." She met his gaze steadily.
"Someone had to. The dead have no hand, Inspector, but they have things left unsaid. Wills left cruel, apologies left unspoken."
"I only lent them my hand." Purbright's voice, when it came, was almost tender. "And the signatures?"
"Those were theirs. I traced them from old documents. It seemed fitting." He regarded the fire. "Fitting, perhaps."
"Legal? Certainly not."
"Yet I doubt you meant harm." "No," she said softly. "I meant amendment. To set right what pettiness and fear had spoiled. I thought if I used their words, or what I imagined of them, I might spare the living a little shame." "The solicitor's collapse?" Her hands tightened. He read what he already knew. His conscience had been waiting for company. For a while neither spoke. The fire clicked softly, a quiet punctuation between thoughts. Purbright moved to the desk, his eyes resting on the paper before him. It bore only a single unfinished line. "Some truths arrive too late to be polite," he said. "You've not posted this one yet." "No," she answered.
"It's not meant for posting," he looked up.
"For whom, then?" "For you." There was no challenge in her tone, only weary courtesy. Purbright regarded her a long moment, then said, "And what do you imagine I will do with it?" "Read it," she said, "and understand that there was no malice, only correction." He picked up the page, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket. "Understanding, Mrs. Danning, is the most I can offer. The law will not know what to do with you. It never does when confronted with kindness gone astray." She smiled faintly. "Then it will leave me be?" "Eventually. It prefers tidy endings." "Yours will require a little dusting." She moved toward the hearth, staring into the small flame.
"I'm tired, Inspector."
"Do you ever tire of reading people?" "Often," he said. "But unlike ink, they don't dry properly." That drew a quiet laugh from her. The first in a long time, he suspected. He replaced his hat, offered a brief nod, and moved toward the door. Before he opened it, he said, "One last thing. The letters, they've caused distress." "I know," she said.
"I wanted them to."
"Only enough to make people remember what kindness costs when it's delayed." He inclined his head slightly.
"You've succeeded." Outside, the night had deepened, though the fog had thinned to a faint, smoky veil.
He stood by the gate a moment, looking back. Through the window he could see her seated again at the desk, the pen poised, unmoving, as though waiting for permission to rest. He walked slowly down the lane, the soft gravel crunching underfoot. Above, the town's lamps flickered like punctuation marks in a sentence too long to finish. By the time he reached the square, the air had cooled further, the silence returning to its usual rhythm. He passed the tobacconist's darkened shop, the solicitor's shuttered office, and finally the church, where one late candle glowed faintly against the nave's tall shadow. He stopped there for a moment, not in prayer, but in reflection. The written word, he thought, was both confession and crime. It could undo cruelty or rewrite it. It could resurrect the forgotten or remind the living how little they deserved absolution. He removed the folded page from his pocket, glanced at it once more, then returned it carefully. In the distance, the train sounded its long, mournful note, and the faint wind carried with it the scent of rain and ink. Purbright turned toward home, his figure dissolving into the pale light. One shadow among many in a town that, by morning, would have forgotten almost everything except the comfort of its own order. The morning after his visit to Mrs. Danning's, Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual. The fog had dissolved into a mild brightness, the kind that makes every surface seem newly washed. He carried under one arm a small brown envelope, light, but sufficient to alter the quiet equilibrium of three people's day. In his office, Miss Teatime sat already installed by the window, her gloves off and her manner composed, as though she had been waiting not for an invitation, but for a cue. Sergeant Malley, less certain of the occasion, was fussing with the teapot, his movements uncharacteristically deliberate. "Milk first or after, sir?"
he asked. "Before," Purbright replied.
"It discourages excitement." They took their seats, the three of them, around the small table that smelled faintly of biscuits and old varnish. The window admitted a modest wash of light. Outside, the sound of the town drifted faintly. A bicycle bell, a dog's bark, the intermittent cough of a delivery lorry. Purbright poured.
"Thank you, Malley. Now, I hope you'll forgive the formality of tea, but I've always believed that truth, when offered warm, travels more politely." Miss Teatime gave a quiet smile.
"You've something to say, Inspector?" The milk won't distract us for long. He nodded, setting down his cup. Quite so. I had the privilege of visiting Mrs. Danning last evening. A gracious woman, thoughtful, fatigued by remorse, though perhaps steadied by it too. Mally paused, the teaspoon in his hand, trembling slightly. So it was her then, sir? All along? Not entirely, said Purbright. She provided the hand, yes. But not always the thought. Miss Teatime leaned forward, interest sharpening her tone. Meaning? Purbright opened the brown envelope and withdrew a folded sheet. This, you see, was found on her desk, unsent. I believe it was meant for me. He laid it flat upon the table. The handwriting, small, graceful, self-conscious, stretched across the paper like a sigh translated into script. If I have borrowed the words of others, it is because mine no longer persuade.
I have been both accomplice and messenger.
Forgive me the handwriting. It is not mine alone. Miss Teatime read the line twice before speaking. That could mean anything, Inspector. Yes, he said, and yet it means something very precise. He turned toward Mally.
Tell me, Sergeant, what do you recall about the ink on the second letter? The one that reached Mr. Plum?
Mally frowned, trying to recall. Bluish, sir. Same as the others. Almost, Purbright corrected. But not quite. That letter had been dipped twice, once in old Holbein's, once in modern Quink. The mixture produced a slight irregularity at the cross-strokes. That, you see, was our clue.
A second hand had assisted her. Miss Teatime's eyes narrowed slightly. Assisted?
But surely Mrs. Danning acted alone. Purbright's gaze met hers evenly. Alone, Miss Teatime, is rarely what people are. Even the virtuous find company in their secrets. He paused, pouring the remainder of the tea into her cup. Would you like to tell us which of the letters you wrote? The silence that followed was not of surprise, but of resignation. Miss Teatime did not flinch. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly.
I wondered when you'd notice, she said at last. Mally blinked.
You, miss? Indeed, she said gently. Only the first two. Mrs. Danning and I met at the church reading circle. She spoke often of righting small wrongs, of giving people the endings they deserved. It struck me as harmless at first, almost poetic. Her voice steadied, but her eyes grew distant. Then she asked if I might help, just to write what she dictated. Her hands, she said, had grown too uncertain. I told myself I was only transcribing sentiment. Purbright regarded her with the mild sorrow of a schoolmaster whose pupil has disappointed him in a predictable way. You lent her grace of form, Miss Teatime. She supplied the moral indignation.
A partnership built upon mutual restraint until one of you decided to use it. Miss Teatime's gloved hands rested still upon her lap.
I didn't know about the letters to Mr. Plum or the Chivers woman. By then she'd begun writing her own. She said I had taught her fluency. A strange compliment. Strange, said Purbright softly. And fatal. Mally shifted uncomfortably. What'll happen to her, sir? Nothing dramatic, Purbright said. No court, no charge. Her letters caused only embarrassment and reflection. Two conditions the law rarely bothers to prosecute.
She'll stop now. I imagine she's already begun to. Miss Teatime looked up sharply. You don't mean... He raised a hand.
Not that.
Merely rest.
She's too weary to continue rewriting other people's sorrows. We shall call it closure. For a moment no one spoke. The kettle on the stove gave a small, resigned hiss. Purbright refilled his own cup, stirring absently. You know, he said, I've come to think of ink as a form of conscience. It remembers what speech tries to forget. You can destroy paper, but never the impulse that made it necessary. Miss Teatime smiled faintly, the expression touched with sadness. Will you tell anyone?
Not if I can help it.
Flaxborough prefers its villains more theatrical. Mally exhaled slowly.
And that's it, sir? We just leave it?
Leave it, Purbright agreed. Let the town enjoy its silence. It's earned a few days of peace before gossip discovers another form of salvation. He stood, carrying the brown envelope to the cabinet. Inside, he placed the folded letter alongside its predecessors. File under moral anomalies, he said. Subheading, Repentance by Correspondence. Miss Teatime rose, smoothing her gloves. You're a kind man, Inspector. Purbright turned, his expression unreadable. Kindness is often confused with economy.
I dislike unnecessary paperwork. She smiled at that, a small, wry tilt of the mouth that held gratitude beneath its polish.
You'll destroy the letters? In due time, he said. Ink deserves its moment of permanence. The clock struck 12, each note clean and deliberate. Outside, the market square had returned to its usual theatre of civility. Shopkeepers arranging fruit, a boy shouting headlines, the wind carrying laughter in small, detached phrases. Purbright looked through the window, the faintest smile touching his face. It's remarkable, he said softly, how quickly order restores itself once truth has been politely served. Miss Teatime followed his gaze. Order, yes, but perhaps not peace. No, Purbright agreed.
Peace is overrated.
It dulls the handwriting, she laughed then, quietly, sincerely, and took her leave. Mally, still unsettled, looked at his superior.
Sir, if you don't mind me asking, why didn't you say something sooner?
You knew? Purbright lifted his cup, eyes following the thin spiral of steam. Because, Mally, confession is only useful when it arrives of its own accord.
Anything else is dictation, the clock ticked.
The air smelled faintly of tea and paper, and something more ephemeral, the calm that follows a truth too gentle to wound. Purbright turned back to his desk, picked up his pen, and wrote one final note in his ledger. Case concluded.
No villains, only writers. Then with a small sigh that was not fatigue but understanding, he capped his pen, leaned back, and let the quiet return.
By afternoon, Flaxborough had resumed its familiar rhythm, the clink of teacups, the gentle shuffle of errands, the sigh of buses stopping in polite resignation at corners where no one truly wished to leave. The sun, pale but determined, fell upon the market square as if rewarding the town for its newfound tranquillity. In the police station, Purbright sat at his desk, a small stack of papers before him. Their contents, letters, notes, and statements that could have been accusations but instead read like apologies, awaited their final journey to obscurity. He opened the top drawer of the cabinet, paused a moment, then began to sort the documents into two neat piles. One bore the label, "No Further Action." The other, unmarked, was for those oddities of conscience that resisted classification but deserved preservation. He preferred to think of them not as evidence, but as reminders that law and humanity rarely agreed on definitions. Mally entered quietly, carrying a fresh ledger.
Sir, I've rewritten the report. Left out the details that don't matter. Purbright looked up, amused.
The ones that don't matter to whom? Well, to anyone official, I suppose? Excellent, said Purbright. That usually covers the truth. Mally placed the folder on the desk.
And Mrs. Danning?
She's resting, Purbright replied.
Her doctor recommends quiet and solitude.
I doubt the town will disturb either. They've found a new scandal, something to do with a baker's misprinted notice about sponge rolls. Mally hesitated.
And Miss Teatime?
Composing a letter of resignation from the reading circle, said Purbright dryly. Citing artistic differences, no doubt. Mally smiled, though faintly. So that's it then, over. Over, Purbright repeated softly. A word we use when we've grown tired of explanation. He took the final letter from the desk, Mrs. Danning's unfinished note, the one addressed to no one in particular, and read it once more. If kindness comes too late, it must at least arrive legibly. He folded it carefully and placed it atop the unmarked pile. Then he closed the drawer with a deliberate click, the sound soft but final, an act less of bureaucracy than of benediction. The clock struck 3. Outside, a warm breeze moved through the open window, carrying the faint rustle of papers and the distant hum of conversation from the square. The town was returning to itself, stitching up its brief tear in civility. "Mally," Purbright said, "you've worked here long enough to know that Flaxborough doesn't really have crimes."
Only disagreements about manners, Mally nodded.
"Still, sir, it's strange. People can forgive anything if it's written nicely enough." Purbright smiled. "That's civilization, Mally."
"Ink and etiquette. Our twin disguises," he rose, crossing to the window.
Below, the postman wheeled his cart along the pavement, whistling a tune half forgotten from childhood. The world, apparently, had decided to continue. For a long moment, Purbright stood there, watching the scene with that quiet patience which others mistook for indifference. In truth, he was listening to the subtle rhythm of ordinary life reasserting itself after disruption. He could sense its delicate equilibrium returning, gossip being rearranged, small sympathies exchanged, reputations gently restored. Flaxborough's genius lay in its ability to forget precisely what had unsettled it. By evening, Mrs. Danning's name would have faded to a whisper. By the weekend, she would have become a moral anecdote, softened by retelling. And by next month, perhaps, even Purbright's involvement would be reduced to a knowing smile and a, "Well, he sorted it, didn't he?" Behind him, Mally gathered the remaining papers. "What should I do with these, sir?"
"Burn them," said Purbright without turning.
"But not today. Let them enjoy the illusion of permanence a while longer." Mally hesitated.
"If I may ask, do you think she meant any harm at all?"
Purbright turned, his expression thoughtful. "None, but good intentions are rather like handwriting, Mally. They're personal, inconsistent, and rarely as legible to others as they are to the writer." Mally considered this, then nodded.
"Still, sir, it feels unfinished." "It is," Purbright said.
"Everything worth remembering usually is." He crossed back to the desk, adjusted the angle of the lamp, and picked up his pen.
"There's a comfort in incompletion."
It leaves room for the imagination to tidy what the truth untidied. The sound of pen upon paper filled the silence. Slow, deliberate strokes. He wrote the briefest of summaries for the record. No charge. Case concluded. Motive, conscience disguised as correction. He signed it, his initials neat and small, then blotted the ink. "Mally," he said after a moment, "fetch us both some tea, would you? Nothing encourages reflection like warmth and tannin." When Mally had gone, Purbright leaned back in his chair. Through the window, he could hear the faint toll of the church bell marking the half-hour. The sound drifted through the air like a reminder that order, however restored, was always temporary. He looked at the closed drawer, then at the sunlight sliding across the floor.
A fine day, he thought. One fit for the illusion of conclusion, and yet...
Beneath that calm surface, he sensed what Flaxborough itself would never quite admit, that every correction, however kindly meant, leaves behind a smudge. The law, he knew, could not polish that out.
Nor could forgiveness. Only time, which writes with the broadest pen of all, could soften it into memory. He smiled faintly,
took up his teacup, and murmured to the empty room, "Justice and kindness. Forever the untidy margins." The town clock struck 4, its echo folding into the lazy afternoon. Somewhere outside a child laughed, a door closed gently, and the day continued its civil choreography. Purbright watched it all in silence, content to let the world resume its ordinary handwriting. By the following week, Flaxborough had returned almost triumphantly to its natural state of small perfection. Curtains were drawn with renewed purpose, gardens resumed their well-regulated bloom, and at Mrs. Bradby's tea-room the conversation turned from the moral hazards of anonymous letters to the far safer subject of municipal paving. A new column appeared in the Chronicle that Thursday, modestly titled "On the Comfort of Names." It occupied a discreet corner near the church notices, nestled between a report on the Women's Institute raffle and an advertisement for denture cream. Its author remained unnamed, though the town suspected, and chose not to say aloud, that it could only have been Miss Teatime. The piece spoke calmly, tenderly, about the reassurance of signatures. To write one's name, it read, is to affirm that one has existed politely, however briefly. Names are the punctuation marks of life. Without them, the sentence would drift into misunderstanding. Purbright read it over his morning tea, the faint smile on his face neither approval nor amusement, but something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, or a fondness for the inevitability of repetition. He folded the paper neatly, placed it beside his saucer, and gazed through the office window at the town beyond, the slow glide of a cyclist, the soft hiss of street-sweeping brushes, the pale sun tipping over the rooftops like a reluctant blessing. Mally entered with a report, his boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. "Morning, sir." "Nothing much today. Just the usual. Missing cat, noisy milk float, and someone's reported a suspicious smell by the river." "Probably cabbage." Purbright took the papers, nodded absently. "Cabbage," he said, as though pronouncing a philosophy. "The most democratic of mysteries." Mally hesitated.
"So, about Mrs. Danning, has there been any word?"
"No," said Purbright, still gazing toward the square. "And there won't be. She's withdrawn into the quiet where she always intended to live. Flaxborough's gossip will follow her there for a while, like a tired dog, and then lose interest." "Right, sir." Purbright set down the report, his voice softening. "We are an unambitious species, Mally. We crave peace, but only the kind that lets us talk about it." He rose and took his coat from the stand. "If anyone calls, I'm walking." Outside, the afternoon was mild, the air touched with the faint sweetness of lilac and newsprint. The square glowed faintly under the pale light, and Purbright's shoes made a measured rhythm on the pavement, steady, reflective, the tempo of a man unhurried by conclusion. He passed the tobacconist's shop, still closed, still ghostly, and paused to look through its dusty window. Inside, the counter remained untouched, the ledger still open where it had been left. The air beyond the glass seemed to shimmer faintly, as if memory itself were caught in a draught. He thought of Mrs. Danning's letters, of how they had begun as an attempt to tidy the moral debris of others and ended as her own confession. He had seen countless deceptions in his time, some petty, some profound, but few as human as this, the crime of caring too much about the proper arrangement of truth. The bell from St. Olaf's chimed the hour. He moved on down the lane where the cobblestones gleamed faintly damp and into the market. Stalls clattered softly as they were dismantled. Voices traded final courtesies over vegetables and fish. The familiar pattern of commerce, that modest theatre of human exchange, had resumed its lines without prompting. He stopped at Mrs. Bradby's for a pot of tea. She greeted him warmly with that particular kindness reserved for those who seem permanently above scandal. "You'll have heard," she said, "that poor Mrs. Danning's gone to stay with her sister near Ripon. Terribly delicate."
"I'm told. Delicate," said Purbright.
"That will be her salvation," Mrs. Bradby nodded approvingly. Quiet woman always was, though I can't imagine what possessed her to go meddling with papers and wills. A touch of nerves, perhaps.
"Happens to us all, doesn't it?"
"It does," said Purbright, "though most of us choose conversation instead of stationery." She laughed, pleased by his gentleness. "I always say, Inspector, it's better to talk things out than write them down. Ink makes everything sound permanent." "Indeed," he said, sipping. "The trick, Mrs. Bradby, is to write nothing you can't one day forgive." The remark seemed to linger, finding a home among the clatter of cups and the faint rustle of newspapers. When he left, she watched him go with that faint admiration she reserved for men who could turn tragedy into politeness. Evening drew on softly, the sky deepening into blue-grey velvet. As Purbright walked home, the gas lamps flared to life one by one, their halos trembling faintly in the mist that crept from the river. The sound of his steps echoed lightly, steady as a clock left unwound but still keeping memory of time. He passed the post office, where the last sack of mail was being loaded. For a moment, he thought of the letters yet to be written, those endless small testaments to ordinary existence. Invitations, apologies, receipts, condolences. All those proofs that people continued to hope they might be understood. At the edge of the square, a boy hurried by with a bundle of chronicles under his arm, calling headlines into the mild night. Purbright caught a fragment, something about a local fete, a prize marrow, a fundraising bazaar. The boy's voice faded into the distance, becoming part of the town's familiar hum. The inspector paused by the bridge, leaning against the cool stone parapet. Below, the water slid past in slow silver bands, carrying the faint reflection of the lamps above. It reminded him absurdly of ink bleeding gently across paper. The same quiet persistence, the same refusal to remain still. He thought of Mrs. Danning's final words. "If kindness comes too late, it must at least arrive legibly." He repeated them silently, almost approvingly. There was wisdom there, he decided, though of the sort that could never be legislated. He turned for home. The windows along the lane glowed with the soft intimacy of evening. The shapes of families moving behind curtains, the gentle blur of domestic order restored. Somewhere, faintly, a piano was being played, hesitant, uncertain, but content with its own modest melody. Purbright slowed his pace, his breath a thin mist before him. He felt, not for the first time, that the town itself had its own conscience. Flawed, kindly, forgetful. It stumbled into its moral lapses with the same absent-mindedness with which it watered its gardens. And like its people, it always believed itself forgiven. At his gate, he stopped. The street was empty now, save for the hush of the lamps and the distant sound of the church clock marking another hour's passing. He looked once more toward the square, toward the post office and the Chronicle office beyond. Somewhere inside, tomorrow's edition was already taking shape, its type neatly arranged, its truths balanced between accuracy and convenience. He smiled faintly, adjusted his hat, and murmured into the mild night. Even shadows given decent ink will sign their names with grace. Then he entered his house, closing the door softly behind him. The light within flickered once, steadying. Outside, Flaxborough exhaled, peaceful, proper, perfectly itself again, its small sins folded neatly beneath the comfort of names. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.